some of our work. And we're really just going to be covering some of the kind of basics of what we do and kind of making sure that we're all talking about the same thing when we're talking about sustainability in agriculture, at least in this context. I'm a researcher at SRUC. I mostly look at the ways in which farmers can reduce emissions from agriculture, greenhouse gas emissions in particular. And we do reports for various bodies that are interested in these things that maybe help guide policy and guide research. I'm just going to start off by covering. I'm just going to rearrange my screens. Yeah, great. The main sources of greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. So before we get started on that, though, I'll do the global warming potential thing. So we've got three main greenhouse gases. We've got, at least when we're talking about agriculture, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. When we're talking about how warming they are, CO2 gets 1 unit, so over 100 years it's got 1 unit of warming potential. Methane is more potent greenhouse gas, so this gets 27 times, but it's important to know that this decays in the atmosphere over time into CO2, and over 100 years it's less potent. So maybe if you average this over 10 or 20 years, it would be a much higher number, but over 100 years, it's essentially CO2 for most of it, so it gets a lower number. And then nitrous oxide is a tricky one. This doesn't really go anywhere in the atmosphere, and it's a really potent greenhouse gas, so that's 273 times. So anytime you emit nitrous oxide, it's a big problem. It's quite hard to get it back out of the atmosphere. So back to this figure from AHDB that I've stolen. These are it just kind of lists out the main emission sources. So the main ones to talk about are from ruminants, so your cows and your sheep and your goats. When they eat food, the bugs in their rumen in their gut convert lots of that energy into methane, and they burp that out, and that's a big source of emissions. And also what they excrete, so their manure, depending on how you store it, can emit a lot of methane. So if you store it as a big slurry pit, that's the ideal conditions for the bugs that like eating the manure and turning it into methane. It's a big emission source, but if the manure lands on pasture, it's less likely to be associated with high emissions. And the next thing to talk about is more arable stuff. So applying fertilizer to crops. So to get good yields, you need to apply fertilizer in one way or another, be that organic or synthetic ammonium nitrate. But not all of that nitrogen that you apply will end up in the crop. In fact, usually around like 60% goes in the crop if you're lucky. The rest will get lost to the wider environment. And this can be lost via nitrous oxide, so direct emissions of this greenhouse gas, or it can kind of leach into the groundwater as nitrate or ammonium and get into water systems, and from there it can be emitted into nitrous oxides. Another thing is ammonia. So this isn't a greenhouse gas, but anytime you see a arrow with N2O, there's usually also ammonia associated with it, and this is a pollutant that can really damage ecosystems and also cause other problems. And then on the kind of and I should say as well, there's emissions associated with like ploughing your fields, right? The petrol and diesel you use to drive your tractors around, so that comes with some emissions. And then on the kind of plus side, there's lots of photosynthesis going on. So there's the trees and the crops are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and turning it into carbon that we eat. But that's the problem, is we take most of that off, right? So we eat it, or it ends up somewhere else, or it gets burnt, and it ends back in the atmosphere. So this is not a really long-term storage of CO2. And there's also respiration of CO2 from the soil. So all the organic matter that's in the soil will get eaten by bugs and emitted back into the atmosphere at some point. And then, yeah, I think I've covered all the basics, all the kind of basic sources there. Okay, onto the next slide. Yes, I was going to say, these CO2 fluxes, the sequestration of CO2 or the emission of CO2 doesn't get included in the agricultural budget for greenhouse gas emissions. This gets put in this kind of mysterious category called LULUCF, which stands for land use change and forestry. And this includes things like if you change your if you change your pasture to arable for a long period of time, this will come with a source of emissions because you're likely ploughing up lots of nice organic or lots of soil with lots of organic matter in it. Or if you plough up a field so you can build some houses, that would get included in this source. But in general, if we're talking about agricultural budgets for greenhouse gas emissions, we don't include these carbon fluxes. Okay, so this is now a pie chart of all the emissions in the UK, and just to point out how that agriculture is about 10% of the emissions. It's not the biggest, but it's not decreasing that fast. So maybe at some point it will be the biggest. So the energy supply is obviously still bigger in transport, and then breaking down the agricultural emissions into their relevant sources. You can see that enteric methane at the top here is pretty much 50% of all emissions of agriculture in the UK, and then manure management here in the orange is 14.2%. So lots of people don't think about manure as a source of emissions, but it carries loads of emissions of NCO and methane. And then looking at the red one, so this is the emissions associated with fertilizer application basically, and nitrogen in the soil. That's about a quarter of it, and then your tractors. And it's not just that the orange and blue one here are the livestock emissions. These are that soils bit here includes emissions of grass that is often fed to animals. So if you wanted to look at the full life cycle assessment of livestock, you wouldn't just look at these orange and blue parts of the pie chart. I think Vera is going to look at this a little bit more, so it kind of contribute getting all of the emissions associated with production. And all the data that I'm showing here, and I will show going forward, is from the government basically, where they're reporting their emissions for the Paris Climate Accord. So this is all the stuff they use for their budget and their statutory targets. So you can look at all these things yourself and look at all the data. Yeah, and here's the plot of how we're getting on basically in each sector for emissions from 1990 till I think it's 2022. I've got up to. And you can see that the orange line, energy is doing pretty well. We've got some solar power, we've got some wind farms, we've got rid of coal, that's good. But the blue dash line, as I said before, that's the agricultural line, that's kind of going nowhere. It's not decreasing at all, really. Other sectors are doing well. I should say as well that in some cases, other sectors decreasing emissions put some pressure on agriculture. So, for example, like the petrol we use now has got 10% ethanol, bioethanol in it, and that has to come from somewhere, right? That comes from agriculture. So there's, as you kind of some methods that they're using to reduce emissions puts more and more pressure on agriculture.
I'm not going to raise every question in the chat, just to let you know, Dan, but I do think this is an important question raised by Shona, and I assume that there's no taking into account of the emissions generated by animal feed that's been imported and the impacts of deforestation and so on overseas. Is that right?
Yeah, sorry, I should have made that clear. Yeah, this is basically the budget for the the kind of climate accord thing, where you only include stuff that happens on that island, basically. So as you import like soy or whatever to feed your cows, that a lot of that can be associated with land use change, and it has their own emissions that happen in Brazil or Argentina or wherever. So it's very much on that island sort of emissions. And another important one is the fertilizer that we use. So ammonium nitrate, if you synthesize that in factories, it's usually in like Germany or Russia or Sweden, I think, that has a massive carbon footprint, and that's not factored in here. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, so I thought, because I understand that you're all different districts of the climate hub, so we could maybe break down this inventory down into each of the local authorities in Scotland. So this plot here is just showing you how much emissions are associated with agriculture in Scotland. It's really important to note that this isn't a function of how sustainable your farmers are. It's just how many cows you have and how many acres of wheat and how many chicken farms you have in your region. Every cow in Scotland is the same in this model and this calculation, so don't take it as other people in the Highlands and Islands are doing better than people in Dumfries and Galloway. That's important to point out. But you can see that basically we've got loads of dairy cows in Dumfries and Galloway, and it's got a monster emissions associated with agriculture. And then in the kind of arable regions, so in here in East Lothian, which I think you're interested in, is actually quite low because there's less animals basically in smaller area as well, and in Fife. And then as percent of that sector's total emissions in the rest of the economy, that's what this plot on the right shows, is like what percent of the emissions in this area are from agriculture. In the like central belt and places like that, there's almost very little. But if you're in a rural area like Dumfries and Galloway, it can be a huge proportion of your emissions. So if you're interested in your local area's effect on greenhouse gas emissions, this is quite important plot. And then breaking this down further into, does the emissions come from livestock or does it come from soil? So the left is what percentage of those agricultural emissions are livestock. So that's manure, methane, and enteric methane, and importantly, not imported feed. And on the right-hand side, this is your soil emissions from this nitrous oxide release. And yeah, starting with the right, you can see your basically heavily fertilized soils. So East Lothian, some parts of Aberdeen and Fife, and this has high emissions associated with nitrous oxides. But looking at, well, even on the left here, even regions that don't have loads of cows, just because they're or ruminants, just because they're such a source of greenhouse gases, they make up a fair chunk. So the lowest value is 35%, even in urban areas, including urban areas. I don't on the right here, I don't know what's going on in Dundee, but they've got a lot of soil emissions. So I don't know how that's calculated. It could be an error in the data, but that's very high for a city, basically. And then this is now this mysterious LULUCF category. So this includes, it's a net thing. So there could be emissions coming out, but also sequestration going in. So forests should be getting cut or planted, things like this. And this is a balance fit. So you can see some are negative. So there's abatement, so there's sequestration, but lots are positive. So this includes, like I said before, cropland forestry, and an important source is peatland. I think there was a question on peat bogs, and I've got plot. This one here. So this on the right is amount of peat emissions in each local authority, and this is a huge number, right? So in the Highlands and Islands, we've got loads of peat, and it's all degraded, and it's emitting loads of CO2, and it's up in the 2000s, which is more than you've seen for the agricultural things. But of course, in the full budget, this gets balanced by the forest, so that's why it's decreased on the left. But yeah, and I think there's a question about East Lothian in particular. There's not much peat emissions in East Lothian. The peat isn't. There's not much peat there in comparison to these areas. And I should say as well, this one is when I said the farming stuff, the agricultural stuff was not a measure of how sustainable your farmers are. This plot is definitely a measure of how bad your peat is. So the way they calculate it is they go and look at all the peat and have the more degraded it is, the more emissions it has, and it's all done by area and it's mapped in very good detail. So this is really a measure of how bad the peat is and how much peat you've got in your area. I had another plot. I can't remember what this was. This was just a comparison to the agricultural emissions, and you can see that the biggest number here is 1400. The biggest number in the peat is over 2000, so it's a huge amount of emissions. And there were some questions on kind of integrating or balancing agricultural and ecology. So how do you increase biodiversity while also producing enough yields to feed everyone? And I've got my maybe very naive diet kind of model of this in my head of what's going on. There's just two ends in my spectrum. This might not be the kind of be all and end all, but there's sustainable intensification. This basically is the philosophy that you can increase yields, and this means there's less land for agriculture, and you can dedicate that land to biodiversity or other things. On the other end, we've got agroecology is what I call it. It's probably not the right word, but basically that's like integrate your biodiversity into your agricultural land, and you don't mind sacrificing a little bit of yield to do so. And I think on this end, you'd maybe include your organic farming, your kind of regenerative farming, And on the left-hand side here on the sustainable, you'd include your rewelding, basically where people are comfortable turning their productive land over into to wilderness because they're confident in the amount of food they produce elsewhere. There's problems with both these things, and none of them are going to solve all of it. It probably needs to be a mixture of the two. On the left, so this kind of philosophy that more yield means less land, it's not a zero-sum game, right? So the more you produce, really what happens is we just get fatter, we eat more foods, we export to global markets, and ecology isn't priced into the market. So there's no reason really for land to become turned over to biodiversity. And on the right-hand side of this agroecology, you might need more land to produce the same amount of food. And how biodiverse is some of these practices, like having a few hedgerows or some wildflower strips or increasing the number of bugs in your soil? It isn't that biodiverse compared to a nice forest, basically, right? So there's lots of things to think about, and there's not like both ends aren't going to solve it. It's going to be a combination of the two. I can't remember why I put these figures on there. I think there was a question around how much of our food gets exported, and I found these stats. I think I put it here in a bit of a place, but 6% of our beef is exported, 26% of our lamb is exported outside. So lots of those emissions, going back to your question about land use change and soy and fertilizer from elsewhere, that would be emissions that are getting exported by us. Yeah, and there's some questions around organic and regenerative agriculture. I thought I'd give my kind of loose understanding of what's going on. Organic agriculture is quite easy to define because they've got a big rule book, basically. So that's nice. It's basically they've got a big rule book of what pesticides you're allowed and what fertilizers you're allowed. The important thing is you're not allowed Haber-Bosch nitrogen. So this is your nitrogen made in factories, your synthesized ammonium nitrate. But because of this, they rely quite heavily on animal manure and plant manure, or what do you call it, plant fertilizer, as a source of nitrogen, because you still need to get crops still need input, right? So you need to give them the nitrogen, and they still use pesticides in certain cases. So it's just the balance of what you can and can't use. Regenerative agriculture is a bit more loosely defined. Yeah, I'm calling it a loosely defined collection of well-established agronomic practices. So nothing that they're suggesting to do is new, really, or groundbreaking. Farmers and agronomists have known about it for a long time, but it's just kind of been packaged up in a nice way, which is and it kind of has a kind of driving philosophy of basically minimizing soil disturbance and maximizing soil carbon. And you can do this by not tilling your field as much, using cover crops to make sure your soil doesn't get eroded or you lose nitrogen over the winter. Contrasting to organic farming, they're quite keen on their glyphosate. Not keen, but they would rather you use glyphosate than you tilled your field, basically. So this is going to be the differences you can think about. And similar to organic, integrating livestock into your system to increase soil health is important. Okay, so this is a very complicated plot. This is a lot of the work me and Vera do, which is kind of the technical stuff. Looking at, I've shown you all the emissions that are reported to the Paris Climate Accords. What we do is look at those and ask, how do we reduce those to get to net zero? And this plot here is called a marginal abatement cost curve. I'm going to explain what everything is. So we've got a big list of mitigation measures. So these are like technical things farmers can do to reduce emissions, or what we think, or the research thinks they can do to reduce emissions. And what we do is we put the width of the bar. So this yellow one is using clover in your grass. And the width of it is how much we think you could abate in Scotland by using this measure if so many farmers took it up. And how high it is how much it would cost per tonne to achieve that abatement, if that makes sense. It's got quite a lot going on, but so the width of it is how much of emissions you could abate, and then the height of it is abatement costs, so how much it would cost to achieve those. And ideally, the bars are wide and they're very negative, right? So they're cheap and big. Of course, that's not the case. So the grass lagoon mix, for example, it can abate about 0.2 megatons, and it saves farmers money, right? So the idea is that you put clover in your fields, and that will supply the nitrogen to the grass, and you don't have to apply fertilizer. So that reduces emissions, and it saves the farmer money on fertilizer. So that's great. It does a great job. And lots of farmers do this, particularly in Scotland already. So it's a well-established method. The next one that I'd point out is this faster finishing beef, which is basically making your beef grow a bit faster, so there's less and to make sure that you finish them efficiently, so that you're not leaving them in the field when they've reached weight that you want to slaughter them at, but you don't leave them basically using the field as a fridge to wait for a better market price. So, and as you wait for it, there's more and more emissions associated with the beef. So this measure saves the farmer money because it saves them money on food, and it is cheap. And then here we've got a measure which is health sheep. So this one, I don't know, it's about 100 kilotons it can abate. This measure is basically to increase the health of sheep. So there's lots of nematodes that in the fields, and the sheep eat this. This affects their digestion and their productivity, and it also directly affects their enteric methane production. So if you can eliminate diseases like this, it will massively, it can reduce the emissions associated with sheep. And soil pH, I think there was a question on liming. I can't remember what was around, but this is basically, this measure is making sure, using lime to make sure your soil's at the right pH. If your soil's at the right pH, you can maximize nutrient availability with phosphorus and nitrogen, and you can reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that's released. And then here we've got a couple of tiny ones, but they're very cheap. This is reducing N excess and reducing soil compaction. Reducing nitrogen, that is N stands for nitrogen, sorry. So reducing nitrogen access is it's pretty obvious. Basically, apply less fertilizer, but try to maintain yields. And soil compaction, if you've got compacted soil, there's more nitrous oxides released due to having higher moisture in the pore space in the soil.
And it's been 20 minutes-ish.
Okay, great. I'm almost
yeah.
Perfect. I'm almost finished. So that's good timing. And now we're getting to the ones that cost money, right? So we've went above the zero line in abatement cost. So the ones on the left, in theory, there's no farmers can do it, and it could possibly save them money. At least that's what we say, but don't take that as fact. But in theory, it could save them money. On the ones on the right hand side where they're above the zero, this is costing money now. So these two measures here are basically, rather than letting your manure, if you've got a big slurry storage, say, letting it being exposed to the atmosphere, you cover it with a big balloon essentially, capture the methane and burn the methane so it turns to CO2 rather than releasing its methane into the atmosphere. This can abate a fair chunk of emissions, but it's costing money. There's no incentive to the farmer to do this, right? And then here we've got feed additives. There's lots of talk around this. You probably came across like 3-nop and nitrate. These are things you can feed to your cows and your sheep, and it reduces the enteric methane production. It changes the microbiome and the pathways in the rumen. Again, this can abate a lot of emissions, but it's quite expensive per ton. I maybe should have drawn on this plot the shadow price of carbon, because that's a good measure of, is it cost effective, but it's not there. I think that's around like 100 or something. Correct? Is that right, Vera? What's the shadow price of carbon?
About I don't know in 2000. So it's increasing because what the shadow price of carbon is reflecting is the damage we are getting from these greenhouse gases, and that's why it's a good comparison. So, and I think by 2050, it is predicted to be 150 or around 200 pounds per ton CO2 equivalent. So by kind of rational economic theory, one could say that anything which is cheaper to do, just do it, because overall that saves money for ourselves, not necessarily for the individual who is doing the action, but it reduces the damages more that it costs. Yeah, but I think it would be above £100 by 2050 with current estimates.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, but yeah, that's a good measure of is it beneficial for the whole society. And then here we've got cover crops, which is we discussed it already with the regenerative practice, basically covering your soil over winter. This kind of, again, it's abating quite a lot of emissions, but it's costly. So farmers will have to buy the seeds and plough the field, not plough the field, but drill the seeds, which all comes with the cost. And they don't get any, they can't sell the crop, right? It's just a cover crop. So it's not, it doesn't give them any income. Right. Yeah, we've got loads of measures here. I've not discussed all of them. Maybe at the end, as questions, we can look into more of them if you're interested. If you pick any out here that you're interested in, to let me know. And I've got some slides on maybe some useful resources if you're interested in agriculture and what's going on in soil health. I'm going to save them till the end, though, I think, to make sure there's time. So I've got loads. I'll cover these later and pass on to Vera. Oh, sorry, and I'll drive for you, Vera, while you talk.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thank you for all of you, to come and listen to us. And I just hope that we can give you some insights from what we have learned as a scientist from fellow researchers. What we are presenting, of course, is just one thing. There are so many opinions and so many value judgments in all this climate change issue and food especially, and not only climate change, but all the other environmental problems we are facing. So what we are talking about is our understanding. It might be not be everyone's understanding, and you can argue with it, and we are very happy to discuss the different viewpoints. Overall, I think we all know that food is good. There are lots of, we can't live without it. We all benefit from it, and especially those benefit from it who are getting livelihoods either directly from farming or somehow in the food industry. So we can't live without it. We also know biologically, chemically, but scientifically that producing food will always come with taking land away from nature and other uses, and with creating harmful emissions to the water, to the air, eutrophication, acidic rain, biodiversity loss, water pollution, and so on. Even flooding by cutting of trees. That's especially, of course, in the UK. We have done that ages ago, but it's quite acute in other places at the moment, but we had done our share as well. So we have all these problems from agriculture, but we have the good things, and it's really a conundrum how we somehow make sure that we get less of the bad things while still keeping more of the good things, or even creating more of the food, because our global population is increasing, and many people who are not eating as much livestock products as we do in the Western world, they want to eat more livestock products as well. So overall demand for agriculture production and land is increasing. Next one, please, Dan. So just keeping on the ugly part of agriculture and food production, just a very quick diagram from the internet, Richie and Rosa, that roughly half of the habitable land of the globe is used for agriculture, so 45%. And out of this 45%, 3/4, 80% is used for livestock production. So that means producing all the grass and all the grains and all the soy to feed the animals we eat. And and these animals provide, of course, very useful, very important sources of not only calories, but other nutrition, protein especially, but iron and other nutrients. But if you compare the share of land devoted for livestock and how much protein we get from it, there is a big discrepancy, of course. And there are places and countries where you can't really live without producing livestock. In Mongolia, you can't really just eat the grass, nothing else grows there. But in other places where crops grow, there would be scope to rely more on crop protein and crop nutrients and rely less on livestock. And that is probably many of you would know. And on the right hand side, what you see is a figure. It's a bit complicated figure, but the message I think most is very familiar by now from media as well, that livestock derived food has a lot bigger greenhouse gas emission footprint than plant-based products, and it also has roughly 10 times, also occupies roughly 10 times as much land as the the same amount of protein obtained from plants. So the overall message is the more plants we can eat, and the more livestock products we can replace with plants as individuals, as society, as countries. I'm mostly talking about the richer countries, of course. The more land we save for other uses and the less greenhouse gases we emit. So I think that's a really important message. It's a really strong scientifically established knowledge, and it's getting out in civil society as well, I think. Next one. Yeah, so this is now a figure from the report on policy gaps we've done. I'm part of the European Scientific Advisory Board for Climate Change, which was established 2 years ago by the European Climate Law. And we look at all sectors, and we created a policy report. It was published last year, where we looked at where we need to get in order to keep the climate targets in Europe. And much of it really applies to the UK. Very, very similar, not only agriculture, but the whole economy. And to get to net zero by 2050, we really should get to by 2040. So in 16 years, that's less of a child growing up. That's just going to S5 from birth. 16 years, we should reach minus 95% emissions compared to 1990 levels. And as you see on the figure on the dashed line, the current plans won't get us there. Next one, please. In that report, we looked at the different sectors specifically, and we are talking now agriculture and land use change because that's the topic of the meeting. But agriculture is not the only sector which is lagging behind. Transport is another problematic sector where there are lots of players, all of us owning cars, whatever, flying and so on. And it's really difficult, or has been difficult so far, to reduce emissions. And the building sector is similar. What we established in this report, or what we summarized from scientific studies in this report, is that in agriculture, we are considerably off track, and the speed of emission reduction needs to speed up by 3.5 times to get to our 2030 and 2050 targets. And unfortunately, what I already wrote in the chat, when we look at the forests, the peatlands, the croplands, the grasslands, all that land use and land use change happening in EU, in the EU and in the UK, it used to be, LULUCF used to be a sink of carbon. So it was capturing carbon every year until I don't know how many years ago, a few years ago, and now it's in the EU, its capacity to capture carbon every year is reducing because the forests are getting older, they don't grow as fast, and we have not done all the afforestation we should have done 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and we are still not doing enough. And it's very similar here in the UK, and I think in the UK it's actually a net source now of emissions, LULUCF, which is really bad news because everyone is hoping that somehow land use, grasslands, forests, whatever, peatlands will compensate for our emissions. Now, actually, right now, they are just emission sources. Yes, next, please. And we also looked at this in this European report. We also looked at the different drivers, any sort of relevant statistics we could find, which could show how our progress towards the goals in agriculture and LULUCF and the other factors are. And the color coding shows that the gray thing is on track and light gray almost on track. The red, dark red is wrong direction, and the yellow and orange are off track. And if you look only at agriculture, then we see that in the EU, fertilizer use is not decreasing in a good enough speed, and beef consumption is really not decreasing. It is decreasing a tiny little bit, but not enough. And actually, dairy consumption has been increasing. So we are eating more cheese, more yogurt, more milk than before. And all these things need to be reducing for us to have a chance in getting close to net zero and avoiding a lot of further damage to climate and biodiversity and the ecosystems. Thanks. Next one, please, Dan. Yes, so this was the EU, the previous two slides. Now we are back to the UK. The Climate Change Committee is publishing the annual progress reports. The left and hand side charts and the middle are from the latest 2024 report. And what it's showing is, again, a few indicators on the left-hand side, a number of ruminants, cattle and sheep in the UK. In the grey area, you see that it's not really decreasing, and the bluish, purplish lines show where it should be going in the future. Peatland restoration and new woodland creation, all really much off track in the UK. Also, the CCC produced a nice chart about the recommendations, priority recommendations, and whether there is some progress in that. And if you see DEFRA, who is the ministry responsible for agriculture and land use, that basically their recommendations are not producing much progress. However, there is still a chance to get somewhere and to improve or reduce agriculture's environmental damage. And the CCC latest carbon budget, which was the carbon budget 6, and based on that they created a report on how to reach net zero. What they estimated is that agricultural emissions could reduce by roughly 20% or a bit more, but most of it is the purple part needs to come and will come from diet change. And the rest is still low carbon farming measures Dan has been talking about, and many of you have asked questions about. Well, in general, and this is what I've seen in the past 15 years working in this area, is that these low carbon practices are good, reducing methane emissions from ruminants, catching the methane from the slurry, and so on, very important. But at most, if really every farmer somehow gets the support and can manage to implement all of these, they might reduce emissions from agriculture by 15%, maximum at a stretch 20%, but not really. And the majority of the emission reduction, if we could change our diets in the UK significantly, it would achieve a huge emission. And this emission reduction doesn't even show how much carbon capture could be done on the areas which wouldn't be used to livestock production anymore if we reduce our livestock production, but produce equivalent amount of protein from the land. We save 90% of that land, which 90% can be used for many things, including afforestation or wetland restoration or just rewilding. Next one, please. So this is what I probably most of us don't really know. So agriculture is used to be supported in the UK by the Common Agriculture Policy, which was the EU's biggest budgetary item. Subsidies for farming, and in England it's been upheld pretty much, in Scotland, it's being reshaped as well. But Scotland, for now, is kind of continuing for a while what it used to be. But basically, this paper I got the figures from, which was published this year, followed the subsidies and added up how much of the subsidies end up in livestock products and how much end up in plant products. And the red is the livestock products. So basically 80%, and that was 10 years ago. So since that, cap changed. But I have to say I have been part of an assessment done by the EU audit office as well, and I could see in detail that it hasn't changed a lot. And the problem is that 80% of these subsidies are ending up subsidizing livestock production. Basically, it's the same as fossil fuel subsidies, if you think about it. From the greenhouse gas perspective, I'm not for the individual farmers. Of course, it's a lifeline for the beef farmer up in the Highlands. They might not be able to operate anymore without those subsidies. So we have to think about them as well and how to solve the problem. But basically, it's a perverse incentive. It's a harmful subsidy, and it's still ongoing. Next one, please. And as I've said, that there have been some change in the EU and in the UK as well in reducing some of our livestock consumption, especially beef, though dairy has been increasing a bit. But this paper published last year, Stuart and colleagues, they mapped it, and they really showed that to be in kind of, it's a rough number encompassing a few items, mostly greenhouse gases, but to be in the boundaries where we want to be, we are still eating the average UK person 7 years ago was still eating 6.5 times as much beef, lamb and pork as they should have been, and still more than 2 times more as chicken and poultry as we should. So there is still a lot of scope to reduce our livestock consumption. And next one, please. Yes, and this is I was trying to put together a few slides on policy instruments, also mostly in relation to citizens and consumers. And we looked at briefly a few things in our work on various policy instruments or interventions governments can do. And one is food labels, which kind of probably getting a bit more accepted, but it's still not very common to see the carbon food labels. It's a good thing because it informs consumers. However, studies so far have been showing that it really works only in a portion of the cases, and overall it can have relatively little effect on purchases and choices in food related emissions. So it can reduce emissions by a few percent, but really what consumers are most sensitive to is price. And if you think about the organic market has been well established. It's around for 20, 30, 40 years. It does get a large subsidy, by the way, through the Common Agriculture Policy and other sources. Still, there is a premium price. We have to pay more for organic products. And why people tend to choose organic is not necessarily the environmental or the environmental benefit, but it's the health benefit. And with GHG, we can't say that you get healthier if you choose a product which has lower greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a problem. The labels for greenhouse gases will not solve, unfortunately, the climate problem, and will not reduce massively emissions from agriculture. Next one, please. So I'm back to my hobby horse of eating less livestock. And again, a complicated figure. Apologies, I left it in. I was thinking about cutting much of it out, but I didn't want to. But just for sake of brevity, if you if you focus on the bottom left corner, there is a chart, and on the horizontal axis, you see how healthy something is. So the more to the right, the less healthy. The left is healthier, and on the vertical axis, you see the environmental damage, that's greenhouse gases, but not only greenhouse gases, but acidification, eutrophication, and so on. The higher it is, the more damage, the lower it is, the better for the environment. What you see, obviously, is that red meat is, of course, stands out as being really highly damaging for both our health and our environment. Red meat meaning beef, lamb, or also pork, in this case, categorized as red meat. Fish, dairy, chicken, and eggs are a lot better for our health, but they are still, especially fish, chicken, and dairy, they are still pretty bad for the environment. And what you get kind of in the safe zone, you would want to have more and more people consuming more and more of those categories which are on the bottom and the left, which is vegetables, whole grains, fruits, potatoes, and a bit of nuts. Nuts have very high water footprint, but also legumes. So we are back to this conundrum of, yes, the best would be if we could just swap much of our livestock consumption to eating legumes and whole grains and fruit and veg. Next one, please. And just wanted to say a few words about the policies which could be used, but not really used, or have not really tried to solve the climate problem from agriculture. And it's a bit probably technical, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but regulation hasn't really been tried very strongly in farming regarding greenhouse gases. And it has been shown to be really effective in reducing nitrogen pollution from Denmark and the Netherlands and areas like that, where nitrogen pollution was a massive problem. This is where actually all the water regulations and water pollution problems arose in the 80s. You can imagine those German people wanting to have a bath in their local lake, and they couldn't because of eutrophication. So the whole thing started there. And in that part of Northern Europe, they started to introduce stronger and stronger regulation on certain farming practices, and it really reduced the nitrogen surplus, the damaging pollution with the nitrogen which escapes farming and pollutes the environment. Next one, please. So apart from regulation and telling farmers what to do and what not to do, which of course, if I'm not a farmer, but if I imagine myself like just living in a flat in Edinburgh, that I do, and if I am now told that I have to open my windows every morning 8 to 9 and then close it, or have to buy a certain type of refrigerator or whatever, I might get upset and I might not want to do it because it costs money, it's inconvenient, and so on. So it's not easy to adjust, and whatever we do with farming and our consumption and transport and buildings, we really have to make sure that our governments, local and country level governments, have policy packages which really help the transition, which don't leave people behind. Because without that, we won't move. Because without that, people don't want the change. And if we stick with the status quo, we will be in big trouble. So to get us moving, we really have to somehow create a policy environment where money transfer can happen towards those who would have been the losers from regulations or taxes. Greenhouse gas tax or emission trading is another option for agriculture, just like it is for industry right now. And interestingly, Denmark is going to introduce a carbon tax on farms, probably in 2 years' time, latest, I guess. There is an agreement to do it, an agreement between industry and environmental groups and the government. And the EU is looking more and more seriously into introducing an emission trading system for farming. The details, so it's not decided yet at all, but there are more and more discussions about how to do it, because it seems that no other ways of policy, no other policies work. Next, please, if we have a next one, this might have been, yes. And yes, just to close, I think this might be my last slide. Another policy instrument could be food tax. And of course, no taxes are popular, and no such interventions are popular with anyone, farmers or consumers. And I understand that. There have been some studies already showing that it could be effective. Now it's mixed results, but if we think about mixed results because of the experimental or the statistical setup also of the work, but if we think about taxes in general, then they tend to work. And the good thing in tax is that the government can increase the tax level, so that if the environmental improvement is not good enough, then the tax level can be increased even more to get us to a better place. And that would mean, of course, paying a lot more for those products, those agriculture products and food items which have higher emissions. That means livestock products mostly. So I think this was my bit, and sorry, we've very lovely run over, and